Bonjour.
It was absurd. It was ridiculous. And that kind of thing, everybody's intrigued by it.
They were good stories that had a little flesh in it.
So here's a young girl who's interested in comic books, who seems to be a savior, but is in fact the opposite.
And yes, this is it. Women. You gotta get some women.
And then my head of distribution says, "What? You bought Emmanuel?" I said, "Yeah, why?"
They remain repulsive, horrific, disgusting, controversial.
And there was lots of it. There were gallons and gallons and gallons of fake blood.
We're going to back like blood, not because, we want to make it look pretty, but because we want you to see it.
And we had to cut.
We want violence to hurt.
Cut. Take everything back now.
To take the filmmakers who really helped to create what is now Canadian cinema, William Fruit, George Mihalka, David Cronenberg, of course, many of whom started with Cinepix. Cinepix really did give them their start.
We started out as distributors in 1962. After having distributed a number of films, some of them were very good, some of them were very bad.
They brought in a lot of European films to feed a desire for Canadians to see movies.
I think it was critical because, again, I think it was an immature industry, and so you needed these strong figures to emerge and really guide the filmmakers through the process. John Dunning, to tip my hat off to John, was a very special guy. He really cared about the filmmakers. He really cared about the films. But the filmmakers couldn't have operated without, and John couldn't have functioned without an André doing the business side.
Well, John, his story is really that his father had the first cinemas in Quebec.
When John was 17, his father died. And his grandmother, who was working in the theater as well, came up to him and said, "Okay, young man, get cracking. I gotta eat, your mother's gotta eat, and your sister's gotta eat, and someone's gonna run these theaters, and it's not gonna be me, it's gonna be you."
Other than running theaters, he had no idea how to distribute films. And so we got together, and that's when Cinepix really took on distribution.
They were two sides of the same head, where you had one ultra-creative, passionate, emotional guy in John Dunning, and you had a very rational, intelligent, reasoned businessman in André Link.
We developed a partnership that was incredible because for more than 35, 40 years, we never had a single argument, and we were very close. I mean, we were almost like brothers. We spent more time together than with our wives.
You really do have two sides of the business. You've got the financial and legal and business affairs side, which André looked after, which meant meeting with lots of people outside of the office, if you will. And my father was the inside guy.
John and I felt that we can't do any worse than some of the pictures that we distributed, so we decided to make Valerie.
The movie was about a woman who enjoyed or didn't, at least didn't dislike being a beautiful prostitute and making lots of money doing it, and not having to live this life of growing up and being a nun in her small Quebec community. So she was going out on her own, and she was doing this. That's the story, and she's successful doing it, and she's happy doing it.
Valerie obviously drew upon those earlier films that Cinepix had distributed and that they'd found to be so successful, the things that you might describe as sexploitation. Valerie, it seems less like sexploitation to me personally. It's very much a love story, frankly.
It was a sentimental love story of a girl that was an escort, you know?
So how do you get people to go see that movie? It's interesting. it's provocative, but what's going to really make them go out in Quebec to go see it? So the three of them sat down and they came up with a strategy. Valerie represented Quebec inside Canada, that she was a prostitute and that she was a metaphor for Quebec.
So since she wanted to make a lot of money, she prostitutes herself, and Quebec was prostituting itself by selling its natural land or whatever.
They were very creative and they had something to say because they were representing the turmoil, the Quiet Revolution.
Cinepix billed it as well in light of the Quiet Revolution and actually used that in the advertising for the film. So you could read that as being explicitly linked to the social climate of Canada at the time, but I also think they'd recognised a good marketing ploy as well.
That caught the attention of a lot of journalists. And a lot of journalists, well, that's an important message that's going to be in that movie. And it created basically a lot of free advertising, because it wasn't just a movie coming out anymore, it was a social message. In the 1950s, it was the Duplessis government in Quebec, and it was the church was a major factor in people's lives. Duplessis ruled the province with an iron fist, and once he left, there was almost like a release.
Everything bursted from every corner of the province. So it was just a trend. Like if you were not to be there, you were too bad, you were too old.
In terms of thinking of films like Valerie as a revolt from Canadian Catholicism, I think it's really important not to overstate the fact that there was a revolution that somehow happened overnight.
That was an era where a lot of things were going on, obviously. The hippie movement, the counterculture movement, a lot of draft dodgers were coming up to Canadian universities and affecting the sort of political climate of debate. I mean, we were protesting everything.
Canada, despite its history of Catholicism, had a very surprisingly open attitude to sex in some contexts. So you have groups like the Catholic Action Groups, which are in action from the 1930s or so, who are doing things like marriage planning groups, where there's actually very open discussion about sex, and there's also an emphasis on personal satisfaction in sexual and marital relationships.
Afterwards, we did L'Initiation, which was in color, and did equally well.
This sauna is a great idea.
Well, we must thank Christy.
Thank you for inviting us.
Oh well, it isn't any trouble. Never anyone here in the afternoon. Whenever I can, I take advantage of it. Glad my father's got an apartment in this building.
They decided to take 4 girls that would get naked.
When André and John decided to make Valerie, when they decided to make Initiation, I think they were saying to themselves, look, let's take a successful genre that we've done in distribution and make it ourselves.
The budget then was $170,000, and we brought it in for $168,000. So by then we learned a few tricks about how does one make a film.
Until Cinepix really showed that in Quebec in the late 60s there could be a viable commercial market for soft porn, with Valérie in 67 and Initiation in 69, which was in color. There really wasn't much going on, and there was less going on in English Canada than there was in Quebec.
The Canadian Film Development Corporation was launched. We relied on them for a couple of films, but we were not amongst their favorites because our films made money.
When we started out in the beginning, being for me the 70s, Michael Spencer, they chose a man who knew a little bit about film.
And to say just that Michael Spencer began the CFDC is really not giving him enough credit.
Oh, it was a Canadian Film Development, that's what it was called. And I think Michael Spencer, all of us did, because he helped us, of course, but he knew film.
Michael Spencer was a producer, but he didn't know the lay of the land, how distribution worked, all the theaters, and how a movie was going to be made in Canada. He didn't know all the players, all the crews, all of the other financiers that needed to be there. So I think that he went to my father and André and said, okay, like, help me do this.
There really wasn't much happening in English Canada and even French Canada. The basic idea was there had been all kinds of attempts to try to get quotas on the screen starting during World War II, and the American majors had fought that.
At the same time, the famous tax shelters started in Canada.
Basically, it was a government incentive to aid an industry.
And I was seeing a number of people starting to fund movies like that. So we're sitting down and think we should do that.
The difference in this case, instead of the government giving money directly to an industry or a company, it was sort of an indirect way to aid the industry by giving personal individuals a break on their taxes, and it was a generous break.
So I left the office and I thought to myself, fuck, $30 million. That's like 10 times the entire Canadian production industry.
And so you had brokers who would like attract that extra money, and then that money would be flowed into film production.
And I got involved because I got known as the guy who could raise the tax shelter money.
Back in the 70s, early in my career as a director, someone said to me, a lawyer said to me, you ought to get Canadian residents. You know, I think it will cost about $3,500 in legal fees, and if you have some kind of Canadian status, you could qualify for the Canadian movies, and you could be directing movies up in Canada. And I remember my famous last words to the lawyer: "This is never going to last."
We were finally given an opportunity to make movies, and that's what we chose. I guess that's really, I mean, certainly it's never been a country that's had the funding to do the big films, if you will.
I think to this day, I could have been working up in Canada.
Everybody tried to restructure their films so they looked like Canadian movies.
So there was an evolution, because what happened was the government then introduced a new capital cost allowance section for Canadian content films.
It was a gigantic boost of capital into an industry that was still trying to find its legs.
I think the tax shelter question is an interesting one, because I think there were two schools. One school was exploiting the tax shelters for personal gain, and there's no shortage of scoundrels who did that. And then you had legitimate guys who were taking advantage of what the government was offering, and André Link and John Dunning were prominent in that respect.
We did over 60 or 70 films in our career with John. And that was the beginning of Cinepix.
If you think you're not afraid of the dark, if you feel nothing can shock you, if you say you don't scare easily, if you believe you've seen everything, then prepare yourself for...
Oh, David was a very interesting person, you know. He had this idea that within a person there is something that really kills him, you know?
One thing about David Cronenberg is that he didn't care about breaking taboos. Did David bring a very unique voice to filmmaking? Oh my God, yes.
Barbara Steele was one of the actors, and there was this monster that in the bathtub crawled in, you know. Some of the board members of Telefilm didn't like Shivers, I believe. He said, well, if the Telefilm is contributing to making a film of the kind, then they might as well open bordellos.
One article that really resonated with the Canadian public and the rest of the media was the Robert Fulford article that basically asked the question to the Canadian public: should your tax dollars be used in making films like this that are going to go around the world and represent Canada?
It certainly wasn't acceptable to Parliament, but it was acceptable to the public, and really paved the way, I think, more than anybody else, for what became the Canadian film industry.
This suggestion that the Canadian tax shelter era led to this series of substandard, really schlocky films is very simplistic. And partly I think it comes from the fact that there were some very vocal critics at the time who were talking about how disgraceful it was that Canadian tax dollars were being spent on these films.
At the time when it came out, it was quite controversial. Every film, as it still is today, has to be passed by the Quebec Censor Board, or la Régie du Cinéma, and back in the day it was called the Bureau. I mean, just look at the name of the organization. It was called the Bureau de Surveillance. It's not Orwellian, but I mean, you can sort of see like we're surveying you. We're making sure that your film production doesn't cross certain boundaries.
What are they? Raging demons from another world? Bloodthirsty creatures that must be killed? Or incarnations of absolute evil?
In fact, I think one of the awards behind me might be the Sitges Award that Shivers had won. It was Sitges, and Sitges is still the festival for horror and genre in Europe. And that was where Shivers had to be released because there was no place in Canada to release it.
Yes, David Cronenberg broke a lot of barriers, and that's why slowly but surely a lot of critics were very against him at the beginning, but still saw somebody original at work.
David Cronenberg was ahead of his time. There's no question about it. What is Shivers if not it's a sexually transmitted disease that was demonstrated in film by Cronenberg at that time before STD was an abbreviation we use in our regular discourse.
So we watch Valerie and we see sexual liberation. We watch Shivers and we see sexual liberation carried to this extreme degree where liberation is almost a disease.
When he's talking about the eroticisation of various things, and I feel that he's reflecting on how we as spectators engage with film and that we're fascinated with disgust.
The 70s were very much the age of suburbia and the age of the high-rise, so Shivers really kind of attacks that modern suburban dream directly.
Because you've got all these people living in the Starliner complex, living a kind of plastic pretend life that's undermined by the spread of disease. So it could be considered a critique of capitalism linked to cities as contaminating spaces, which would tie in with kind of the notion of Canada's wide open, pure spaces, if you like.
The biggest success for Shivers was in the UK. It went to the Edinburgh Film Festival, and someone from the BBC picked it up.
If this picture doesn't make you scream and squirm, you'd better see a psychiatrist.
In fact, from the UK, we got more money in than what the film cost. And so that was a big one for us.
All around her, people are dying.
When we followed up with Rabbit, it was even better. And we had Marilyn Chambers as an actress.
Come quick. You gotta come quick and get me.
Sissy Spacek was his first choice, but I think he was actually quite pleased with how Marilyn Chambers fitted into the role. And within the diegesis, she does that really effectively because she can switch on this charm that she's obviously accustomed to switching on in porn films, this seductive charm. So she's both transgressive and alluring at the same time.
Marilyn Chambers was doing adult movies, and she was being shown at the Eve Theatre, at the Bijou in French, at the Guy Theatre, and the Pussycat, and all these other adult theaters that were going on in Montreal, and there were a lot of them. So Marilyn Chambers was a known entity, but she was only doing adult movies.
I think Marilyn Chambers is absolutely perfect in Rabid because she's got this very subtle and kind of non-threatening sexuality. She's almost this girl next door looking figure. And I think that is important because despite Marilyn Chambers' own background in the adult film industry, it frustrates reading that film as simply this sexploitation film because she isn't that explicit sex symbol in the film.
If she can act and she can pass the screen test, why shouldn't Marilyn Chambers have a role in a non-adult movie if she can be a great actress?
The transgressive element is down to the female.
It's Rose, it's gotta be. Something's happened to Rose.
And there's an element then of resisting feminism, or critiquing feminism, if you like, in the way that the female protagonist becomes the lead perpetuator.
I think you can read an element of both feminist and anti-feminist sentiment into Rabid, depending on how you look at it. The woman as a prisoner of her body, or of women as sexual predators, for example. There's that fantastic shot where Marilyn Chambers has just left the cinema and she's walking down the street and there's a lobby poster next to her for Carrie, so there's this doubling of malevolent female power on screen.
The outbreak of the new strain of rabies as being potentially the worst of this century.
The 1970s was definitely a period of anxiety about rabies and about the spread of rabies, so Rabid undoubtedly taps into and capitalises on that.
You can't trust your mother. Your best friend. The neighbor next door.
But a lot of the scenes in Rabid of martial law being imposed in the city are also reminiscent of the response to the 1970 October crisis, when the War Measures Act was implemented, which put a lot more police on the streets.
The Prime Minister was reluctant to officially declare a state of emergency, but as any citizen in the streets can tell you, martial law has come to Montreal.
That became, I think, very reflected in Quebec films of the time. A lot of political content started to appear.
The theme of the city under siege that you see in films like Rabid would have been, I think, disturbingly familiar to a lot of Canadians in light of the activities of the Quebec Liberation Front. So the front bombed buildings, they bombed railways, they would paint slogans in city centres, and they even, at one point in the October crisis, kidnapped and apparently murdered a politician.
At that time I was a separatist. I in fact had a lot of arguments on that with a very good friend of mine who was Premier Robert Bourassa, we were very close friends. And but I never advocated violence, so it was surprising that this would happen in Quebec, you know.
The world was not secure.
And the FLQ was doing this. Oh my God, guys are making bombs and blowing everything away.
So there was an explosion of films made in Canada with tax shelter money.
I was broke, absolutely broken. It's the only script I had. And I sat down, polished it very quickly and rewrote some, and I took it to Cinepix because I really liked them.
This man and this woman are off to play house for a couple of days. He's a wealthy bachelor. She's a beautiful model. They're looking forward to a terrific time.
Mr. Dunning was a kind of amused me. He took Death, and maybe it was the right thing at the time when we were doing Death Weekend, for instance. He said, look at that guy, he's really good, you know. He said, get him to pick his nose. You know, today you see people picking their nose on television, but at that time, no way. I'm not gonna pick your nose, you know, and they're bad enough as they are. But I did it anyway, and I think they were right. They wanted those characters full. I'm not really big on violence, believe it or not.
A house of secrets. A house of evil. A house of pain.
If you're going to make a violent movie, which it was, I'm not going to pull punches or go on corner. Let's give it to them the way it really is, or the way it would be. With goons like this, you know, you're really in trouble.
Social and political turmoil of 1970s Canada really comes through in a lot of the films of this era. The gang who are at the centre of Death Weekend, who are this disenfranchised, very angry group, I think also taps into that sense of anxiety at the time about economic displacement and economic problems.
Yeah, sure. It was a true incident, not carried as far as it was. A friend and I, when I lived out west, we were out driving through the prairies one day, and if you know prairie roads, they can go a long way before there's a crossroad.
With this car, you don't have to be afraid. Are you kidding? Trust me!
Anyway, I don't even remember where we were going, but along comes a car, much as the same as in the picture, screeching past us. We're on gravel roads, dust, dirt, and then it slows down. There was probably 3 or 4 in the car, just like in that thing. And suddenly, I mean, they're screaming, yelling obscenities. What? We don't even know these people. Just some prairie boys having a little fun on a Saturday afternoon. Then the beer bottles started coming. And these roads are narrow. And it's custom note there. Every road has a ditch. And you go in the ditch, you're not coming out again. So we went as far as we could. It went on and on. We knew we're not going to get around these guys. So he just stopped. My friend who's driving, well, put, 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 put. We're not coming. So they turn around and they start coming. He hits the gas. He goes for it. I kid you not. I am crapping my pants. Well, they chickened. And I said, what the hell are you doing? He said, they're not going to come at us. They're not going to come at us, I assure you. And I knew that. And he spun around, they spun around, that's all, and we went back the other way. There the imagination just took over, and I thought a girl.
My God, what's happening?
I'm going to put this girl through the paces. Everything you see a guy doing, saving himself in every natural way or taking advantage of things to do.
It was maybe one of the first one that showed a woman defending herself and in some very graphic way.
There weren't any other stories. The closest one was Lipstick, had come out at the time, where the Hemingway girls, and one goes out and finally shoots the guy that raped her sister. I remember when I saw the first cut, I almost went into shock. Then I saw all the blood flying around and throats being ripped. I mean, I was there when it was being shot, but you didn't get the feeling of it until it was incorporated into the story. And I thought, whoa, you're gonna get hit for this one. I was declared as a woman hater. That's what they got, that I hated women. It was just so far out, I couldn't even do anything but laugh at this. This was wonderful. But it was one of these government bureaucrats who's a film specialist, so.
You have something like that coming out, which was graphic, and they were not used to it, you know. It was like a put down on Canadian films.
Well, I think the content, Halliwell called it pornography. It was a shocker everywhere.
Especially in English Canada. Canadian films had no chance whatsoever. The critics were abominable.
You'll run from the theater in fright.
A comparable film would have been Straw Dogs. In fact, it made me hesitate about doing Death Weekend. I rewrote a lot of it from the original.
Brenda Vaccaro was a very good actress, and it went very well. I mean, we had one location, which was on the lake.
A 200-year-old mansion surrounded by acres of woods and crystal blue water.
And there again, the film went worldwide. And Bill was a very, very competent filmmaker.
I can say nothing but good for Cinepix.
In terms of things like production speed, I guess you could see a lot of Canadian cult cinema as very similar to films like those of Roger Corman in America.
Well, I would say that we were for a while called the Roger Cormans of Canada.
Oh, no doubt about it. I mean, I used to see their names. Cinepix to me was, just synonymous with the best of the exploitation films in Canada.
I would say that the achievements that André Link and John Dunning had at the time was certainly in Canada, was unprecedented.
I identified it the same way I identified AIP and New World and other companies. Cinepix was a brand.
We hear all these sleazy stories about people. Dunning and Link were not sleazy. Know that. They were first-class gentlemen, and they were at the top of the field. That made me proud to have my name associated.
One thing that Cinepix always was trying to achieve was trying to create a franchise.
Ah, masterpiece. That is the ultimate amazing movie of all time. ILSA, She-Wolf of the SS. Saw it at the Apollo Theater on 42nd Street, where the audience went crazy.
The ILSA films, to me, suggest this sense of confronting national identity and coming to terms with traumatic pasts.
ILSA was, the first one was based on a book that my dad had read called Les Médecins Maudits. And it was about these experiments that were being conducted in Nazi Germany, and apparently they were true.
It was based really on, probably in a way, Ilse Koch, that you might have heard of,
The first ILSA film is loosely based on that book that my dad read. They went to a guy, he was an academic who was classically trained, he's educated classically in Canada. And so I think that perhaps adds a little more credence to the subject matter that was being put on film.
It was so well written. That's the thing about it. It was so well written. It's tight.
Ilse was a female villain, She was the one that made lampshades out of people's tattoos.
It wasn't racist, the film. It was violent. It was violent to humanity, which is what what Nazi Germany was about. It was violence to humanity. So this was just a fictional account of violence to humanity.
I never dreamed for a minute what the reviews have suggested, that I was there to promote it. No, that is not true. The truth is, I was an actress. I did a role. And maybe if I'd been a little more famous, it would have been more acceptable.
I think the ILSA movies fit into this Canadian tendency to, in film, look things kind of squarely in the face and to laugh at things that are repressive, because the ILSA films are, in a way, very comedic.
Ilsa tried to survive, and fortunately she got killed in every film, but they just kept remaking them and forgetting that she was dead already.
The second one was Ilsa Harem Keepers of the Old Sheiks, and that was more a light-hearted, and then Ilsa Tigress of Siberia, which was shot in Montreal.
That infamous Ilsa woman, Dyanne Thorne, is back in her latest role as the Tigress. This time, she's running an exclusive Siberian resort.
How important was Dyanne Thorne's performance to the series? She is the series, bar none.
Cinepix started, before I did, Rabbit, Shivers, L'Initiation, the famous Daniel Ouimet movie with Denis Roux, which was the first time you saw a bit of a breast and a bit of,
I get the feeling that the party was the moment of truth for some of us. A turning point, perhaps.
But as I said, we were friendly competitors, and we even partnered on a couple of movies where we would alternate who had the distribution, but we would co-finance, which would reduce the risk of each party.
Well, I think Pierre's a legend. He continues to make films today. He's got incredible energy, integrity, and he was around at that time.
Then I had as a partner Victor Solnicki from Toronto, who happened to know a guy called David Cronenberg. So he calls me and he says, I have a script here by David Cronenberg. You want to read it? It could be our first movie.
Never before have you faced anything so strange and sinister, so bizarre and unnerving. Never until now. David Cronenberg's The Brood.
It falls into a trend of films around that time where the female reproductive body is presented as an object of disgust.
Are you ready for me, Frank? I seem to be a very special person now. I'm in the middle of a strange adventure.
I want to go with you wherever you go.
Do you?
Yes.
Then look!
The Brood.
And I said to him, David Cronenberg works with Cinepix. And he said to me, well, they don't want to make this one. I read the script, and then I called Victor, and I said, I don't get it, why they won't want to do this. This is a weird little thriller or horror, but it's not far out there. I mean, it can work.
We didn't pass on any film that David, just that there were people that had, I would say, more financial base that David could call upon. And if he had come to us for Brood, we would have said yes in a heartbeat.
Ah, The Brood. I saw The Brood at a cinema on Broadway. I think it was the Cinerama on Broadway. And I loved it. I loved the picture. I thought it was so creepy and spooky, and it was a really, really disturbing movie.
You can run, you can hide, and hope they won't find you, but you won't escape.
That's the key word with David Cronenberg films. I think key word is disturbing. You know, that's the way to describe his films from that period.
I said to him, David, there's so much money around that I can make a movie with you this year, but I've got to make it by the end of the year. If you want to make it, let's go right now.
I would like to scan all of you in this room, one at a time.
He said, well, I have an idea called The Sensitives. It's sort of half-written. It's about people with extraordinary telepathic power and all that.
There are 4 billion people on Earth. 237 are scanners.
But then we had to make the movie, and that's a whole different story. Everything that could go wrong went wrong. The script was not ready, okay? So we were sort of writing as we were making it along.
The pain begins in your flesh, in your brain.
Then we had Jennifer O'Neill, who hadn't really read the script very well. She took the money, but then she realized it was a horror film. She didn't like horror film. So there were many heads exploding in the movie. She said, I can't have that many heads in the movie. I won't do it if there's that many heads in the movie exploding.
You can't breathe. It chokes you. It destroys you.
Then nobody knew how to explode a head. So the first time we tried it, it was like little melons going everywhere. It's a disaster. So every Saturday for 4 weeks, we had a second unit going in a warehouse in Montreal, trying different ways to explode the head, and nothing was working. It was smoke, it was the pellets, it was everything. And then, you know, our prop master, Gary Zeller, who just died, unfortunately, said, fuck this, I'm going to try something else. He took a shotgun, a sawed shotgun. He went under the mannequin with the shotgun like this, and he shot right into the head. And it blew up beautifully.
There's a special night in the lives of all of us. A night to be beautiful, to be desirable. A night we can break all the rules and make our own. Prom night. Everyone at Hamilton High is getting ready for prom night. It's a day of rehearsals, arrangements, final preparations, and last-minute phone calls.
Nick?
Canadian slasher films, now that when we watch them now, look much less formulaic than the American slasher film that came afterwards. I mean, films like Prom Night, you've got this very strong thread of the disco in it as well, which almost verges on the ridiculous at points.
Tonight, someone has come to the prom alone.
In the case of the slasher film, one of the films that is frequently cited as the original slasher film is Black Christmas.
Black Christmas totally inspired me and influenced me when I was a kid. I remember seeing when I was younger and thinking again, it was one of those films that is what you didn't see that was scary.
It was actually much smarter than a generic or average slasher film. It was a really clever movie, and it was a film that seemed to be part of what was going on in Canada and Canadian filmmaking at the time.
At the time, Black Christmas was scary as hell because it's the fear of the unknown, and they built tension and scares.
There was a little girl murdered over in the park tonight. Yes, I heard. Your phone's ringing. Hello?
Hey, Mommy. There's a baby. Baby, all right, Mom.
Hello? Who's there?
I know you're there, now, baby. You answer me as bad. Mommy. Come here.
Where's Agnes?
You won't.
What are you doing?
The original motivation to make a sequel to Black Christmas wasn't even so much to make a sequel, it was to take this film, which is a great film, and continue it as a brand.
So one of the key omissions from the Black Christmas remake is the abortion subplot. So in the original, Jess is depicted talking with her boyfriend about getting an abortion. And this is a really direct result of contemporary discussions in Canada at the time. Just before Black Christmas was made, there was a very long-running trial of a doctor in Quebec who had been in trouble for performing illegal abortions. And in 1974, as a direct consequence of that trial, you get the Abortion Rights League in Canada appearing.
But then, of course, Black Christmas led to things like Prom Night and My Bloody Valentine, but it also led to Halloween and all these other movies that weren't being made in Canada.
In terms of iconic slasher films from Canada, you've got to have My Bloody Valentine, you've got to have Black Christmas, and you've certainly got to have Happy Birthday to Me.
At the time, I was not interested in I was making sort of surreal films. I was making very hard-hitting satire in my student films. My documentary was about homelessness. I lived with them homeless for 3 months. And then we introduced a camera to them. We slept in missions and got fumigated and drank all night with them and so on and so forth. But anyway, I was much more socially conscious. I wanted to make political thrillers. I wanted to make political commentary. But on the other hand, I was looking at it saying, here's an opportunity.
In this town on Valentine's Day, everybody loses their heart.
My Bloody Valentine is the almost perfect film to me.
Roses are red, violets are blue. One is dead, and so are you.
Slasher films, I don't know. Unconventional, yes. Horror, yes. Scary, yes. Slasher is... It was a very well-made film. Mihalka did a hell of a good job. And it was scary. We had a problem getting the R rating, and we had to cut out some of the scenes.
We thought, screw it, we're going to make the Deer Hunter of horror films. You know, we want to put some social commentary into this. We want to put reality into this. What we want to do is, we don't want to make the violence pretty. We don't want to make violence shot like a fucking beer commercial. Am I allowed to say that?
There's also a really nice folklorish element.
This ain't no fairy tale, little girl. If you don't take it seriously, you're a fool!
To My Bloody Valentine, in the story, the subplot about the miners' accident.
It was almost urban legend, and it's true. It's not a legend, it's a true story, that a lot of the material that George shot ended up being cut out of the film. And at the time, Jack Valenti was the head of the Motion Pictures Association. The film was going to play in the US, so they absolutely did not want to have the gratuitous gore and gratuitous blood.
And we had to cut, you know.
That era was as concerned with social criticism and political realities, but it was also concerned with making fun movies.
Again, I have to go back to what George did. George, it was shot, it wasn't shot in a studio, it was shot in a mine. It was real. And there was real danger in that mine when they were shooting. It could collapse. It was an abandoned mine, so it could collapse. I know there were some issues about the safety of it, and so I think the fact that it was shot in a genuine location maybe added to the reality and the authenticity.
The miner, in a sense, is the revenge of the working class. The ruling class, the establishment, was celebrating this frivolity, and celebrating this frivolity was actually more important than the safety of the people working.
Particularly in the 1970s and the 1980s, when you see people being more aware of the risks, the health risks of asbestos, as well as the physical dangers of mining, it lends that gas mask of My Bloody Valentine a really quite evocative element.
My Bloody Valentine.
Well, the tax shelter system helped every type of movie you could imagine.
It's a system that, unfortunately, got a little abused in the process.
It didn't matter what got made, just anything had to get made. So it wasn't about entrepreneurial filmmaking, it was about entrepreneurial tax shelter making.
At the same time, the investors were protected. If the film didn't make any money, well, the investment was deducted off their future taxes. So in one way or another, it was a kind of a, surprisingly enough, if you could call it, because there's no such thing as win-win, but it was the closest thing to a win-win situation.
We would land, go and make a speech to wealthy doctors and dentists and architect, whatever, and leave. I did that for weeks, okay? There was so much more money than scripts. We were being called by everybody. You have another project, you have another project, we'll shoot anything, shoot the telephone book, shoot, we have money, we have money, we have money. And the problem is a lot of people took advantage of that, and you had so many horrible films made at that time.
Yeah, a lot of them were flawed. We were starting out. We didn't really have a feature industry to speak of.
But the number of overpriced bad movies that never even got distribution, never played movie theaters, was remarkable.
It was like money on trees, okay? If you're smart enough to get the money on the tree, if you have a script and you have the right broker and the right, Everybody was in the play. One of the biggest fundraisers of the Canadian tax shelter industry was a rabbi from Winnipeg.
Unfortunately, we ended up with a few carpetbaggers in the industry who decided to take advantage of that system, raise way more money than they necessarily would have needed to make a film. And then they figured out that maybe people would make more money by the films not actually being ever released, because then you could immediately just claim it as a loss.
And after that, we had Hollywood North, lawyer's game. The whole thing becomes a lawyer's game, what they want. It had nothing to do with, I mean, look at the films they produced. Some of them were terrible. Every crappy script that was in a trunk somewhere in Hollywood jumped out right away. Hollywood North, we're there.
If you wanted to make a film, as long as you were passionate enough about it to meet up with a group of dentists or lawyers or doctors or businessmen who happened to have money that they wanted to invest in something, the chances were very good that you could get some financing for your film.
Because fewer than 10% of the movies that got tax shelters ever made a profit. And so, you know, all the doctors and lawyers that were trying to defer taxes to a future time and then make a return on investment had a very ugly awakening.
When the tax shelter era was over and we had gatekeepers and we started having places like Telefilm, they then had a responsibility to say, okay, well, we should not be making this exploitative film. We should be making art.
And that's why after the tax shelter, Telefilm took a big stand when the government, Heritage Canada, I don't know what it was called then, and everybody said, let's make this organized with the help of the industry.
It became so prevalent at one point that unfortunately the tax shelter system was scrapped in favor of the tax credit system that we have now.
Because I started in the early 90s, so I had just missed that tax shelter era. And so that easy money, which in some ways you could look back on and say, well, that was not a good way to spend money. In other ways, you can say it was a fantastic way to spend money. One thing's for sure, the two beneficiaries of the tax shelter era were world cinema, in my opinion, and lawyers.
And then after Cinepix became CFP and ultimately became Lionsgate, I mean, André was very influential in doing films, and John as well, and such as American Psycho and Buffalo 66. So the evolution of that group certainly transcended any pigeonhole.
Lionsgate Films has had a very important impact on world cinema to a certain degree, given that they really are a studio now. But having grown out of Canada and being a result of the Canadian system and the Canadian industry, they've had a huge impact on Canadian film, and in particular on my career. The second movie I ever made was a very small genre movie called Ginger Snaps. When I first started working with John Fawcett on Ginger Snaps, I knew, because we'd made a short film together, and then we realized that, oh, we really liked working with each other, and we seemed to bring out the best in one another. And the same thing happened with Brett. Brett had been an editor on a previous film I'd made called Blood and Donuts, and he was just such a unique thinker.
The first film, we equated the lycanthropy with menstruation, and it was about a woman coming of age and your body going through changes, and those changes, whether it's from a girl into a woman, but in the first Ginger Snaps, it was from a girl into a female werewolf.
They were really female stories.
And I think that was one of the triggers of the Ginger Snaps. It was these two girls against the world. They lived or died by their own merits, no one else.
We set out to try to do something that would be unique and would be different, and the way to do that was to not have male leads. Back when we made the first Ginger Snaps, like 95% of all movies were male leads. It's one way that we could stand out was by having female leads.
I guess it's easy to say that Ginger Snaps, because it's revolves around those issues of female bonding and of literal sisterhood, is informed by Canadian past in terms of Catholicism and a lot of women going into religious service. At the same time, I think you shouldn't overstate that element. of sisterhood in Ginger Snaps. So you see the same kind of female bonding in films like The Craft, for example, that intense female friendship.
The success of that film has mostly to do with the fact that teenage girls at the time identified with it, probably in a way that Canadian teenage girls have never identified with a Canadian movie before.
And in the second film, we were trying to equate the lycanthropy with a blood disease.
We made the first film. They were only our foreign sales company. They weren't a distributor in the US. And then when we wanted to make a sequel, they said, yeah, they would come in and they would be the distributor in the US. At which point I said, well, then we're making 2 of them. And they agreed. They were wholeheartedly supportive of Canadian-made genre films.
Actually, it's kind of just occurring to me now. It's in Orphan Black, it's another strong female who discovers she doesn't control her own body. And that's what a lot of horror films do. They take something that you think is a safe environment or that you think is something that's normal, and it's thrusting this uncontrollable urges at you. It's making you not being able to control your own body.
I think Orphan Black has been really successful because it plays on those issues of personal and national identity that have been really at the forefront of Canadian history. So this sense of a specific group being under attack for something and trying to preserve their way of life, it kind of resonates with issues in the past about language and about sovereignty for Quebec, for example.
I don't know if we'd see ourselves as uniquely Canadian, but we're certainly proud to be Canadian, and we don't shy away from the fact that we're Canadian.
I think we owe most of it, at least from a cinema history point of view, to David Cronenberg with all of his body horror.
Some people might, of the time, may have claimed that it debased Canadian national cinema. That begs the question of what is Canadian national cinema?
You know, there have been so few stories up until then, not counting Quebec, about Canadians. There were always people, like I say, most of them were from Britain. They were copying the styles and the kind of subject matter they had there. So there was nothing really pointing to Canadian as far as I'm concerned. If there are, I can't bring them to mind right away, but they would be few and far between. Most of them were the kind of films we could make, like Valentine, like Death Weekend.
I think that there was, at the time, a very negative way of looking at Canadian films.
I guess it debased Canadian cinema enough that David Cronenberg was able to make so many movies that ended up making him one of the icons of auteur cinema.
Let's use David Cronenberg as an example. He's a young guy. He obviously had a very particular point of view about filmmaking. And who knows if a guy like that may not ever have gotten a break if he lived in Los Angeles. Other guys did, but this guy may not have. So it might be directly related to the fact that these tax shelters existed, that a David Cronenberg career now exists.
You can dissect the results, but it doesn't really matter because now we are taken seriously worldwide.